It's not often that a political poll really unnerves me. Usually they're off a percentage point or two or three or four or five from what I thought they might be, but a new one knocked me to the floor. When I got up, I read it again and it fell down once more. A poll conducted about voter identification ID at the polling place indicates that half of New Mexico voters surveyed believe that fraud takes place and has taken place at the voting booth. Incredible. There's never been in recent living memory a case of voter fraud prosecuted. Believe me, there are plenty of prosecutors who would like to find one. David Iglesias, the former New Mexico attorney for the federal government, says he was charged with trying to find voter fraud, looked for it, couldn't find it, and so he prosecuted no cases. Well, that's our lead story on today's At Noon. It's coming up right now. There's an old adage, say something loud enough and long enough and people are likely to believe it, whether it's true or not. That seems to be one of the lessons learned from a new political survey among New Mexico voters. The survey is being discussed in the halls of the legislature as debate continues over whether it's a good idea to have photo ID requirements at the polls on Election Day. Supporters say it would prevent fraud. Opponents say not everyone has a photo ID. The little abuelita is one. A Native American living in a pueblo could be another. A person who simply doesn't have a driver's license because they bus or bike to work would be another. Should they be prevented from voting? That's the question being debated by lawmakers who are debating that photo ID requirement. And supporters are getting some ammunition from a survey conducted by a respected Albuquerque political pollster. Among other things, the poll finds that half of those surveyed said they had actually seen voter fraud at the polls or had learned it had actually happened. Incredible numbers, especially since there's no record of any fraud ever having been prosecuted in New Mexico, at least not in recent memory. Contributing to the questions on the survey just issued is UNM political professor Lana Atkinson. She joins us on the line. Those are incredibly large numbers of people who believe that voter fraud actually exists. What do you make of it?
There's no evidence of systematic voter fraud, but there is a lot of talk. The truth is, I think the talk about fraud is louder than the truth about fraud.
And so do you think people's opinions are swayed then when they hear the talk, that they then think there's been fraud, they think they've seen it?
That's one possibility. One of the things that we really need to follow up on a study is what are people taking away about fraud? Did they hear about, the voter registration issues going on with Acorn in New Mexico and other places and say, make an inference about that? Were they asked to register to vote and felt that was a problem in terms of voter registration? We don't know what that means. We didn't ask about, unfortunately, what that means. And so we need to understand that. And I think the Secretary of State's office and the county clerk's office, they need to, set in place a lot of media themselves so that people feel confident in the electoral system, so that there's an alternative voice about the election system. Because I've observed the election system a lot in New Mexico, and I believe that for the most part, I strongly that actually it's a working, it's a working system. It's working. It's functioning. The votes are being counted correctly. I've counted 50,000 votes by machine multiple times, and we get the same answer. So I really feel confident in our voting system, and somehow, there's been this gap, I think, between what's going on in the voting system and what the news is. And I don't think that's any particular party. I think both the Republicans have been at fault for that, and I think the Democrats have been at fault for sort of taking down the voting system. We can go back to 2004 and 2000, where the Democrats whined and cried a lot about voter fraud and voting manipulation, and the Republicans did it more in 2008. So I think we're all at fault
So you think the
for
talk then,
making the system less trustworthy than it is.
So you think the talk then has led to this widely held opinion that there is voter fraud?
That at least it whether it's systematic or whether that would be my take on the system. But that's a very that's my sort of perspective from observing it and also knowing how we frame the issue. News is about conflict, and when you raise that kind of conflict, that's what gets a lot of attention.
The former
whole thing about and people, when issues get framed for people, they take away those messages. And the message, for example, we had an election audit in this state where we compared the votes between the paper ballots and the machines, and they were all, accurate within about 0.5%. So, here's evidence that there is no fraud. Was there a story on that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the former U.S. Attorney for New Mexico, David Iglesias, was under intense pressure to find evidence of fraud. He lost his job in part because he didn't find any, couldn't prosecute it. He says he would love to have found fraud, but couldn't find it.
Couldn't find any, right? But that story think about what happened to that story. That story, I think in the public's eye, came more about separation of powers and whether Domenici should have called Iglesias and what that meant and, all of this kind of stuff. So I think the New Mexico spin on that story, became something different than the underlying message of there isn't any fraud.